The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of the Riverside Country Club's ballroom. 200 guests turned toward the sound, their conversations halting mid-sentence as my sister Madison stood frozen at the microphone, her face draining of color. She had just finished her maid of honor speech about how I'd finally found someone willing to settle, when the simple platinum band on my left ring finger caught the chandelier light in a way that made her gasp. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Liza, she whispered, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent room. Is that what I think it is? I looked down at the ring I'd been unconsciously twisting throughout her entire speech. The ring I'd kept hidden for 6 months. The ring that was about to change everything my family thought they knew about my life. Around me, faces that had moments before worn expressions of polite sympathy for the perpetually single sister now showed confusion, shock, and something else I couldn't quite identify. You're already married? Madison's voice cracked on the last word. The question hung in the air like smoke, and I realized there was no going back now. The secret that had protected my happiness for months was about to explode into the open, taking with it every assumption, every cruel comment, every pitying look my family had given me for the past 32 years. 3 days before that moment, I had been standing in my downtown Chicago apartment, watching Madison pace across my living room like a caged animal, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her phone screen as she rattled off last-minute details for my engagement party. The caterers confirmed for Saturday at 2, the flowers will be delivered by noon, and I've seated Aunt Beverly far enough from Mom that they can't start their usual drama about the divorce, Madison said without looking up. Oh, and I made sure the photographer captures your good side when Derek proposes. You know how photos can be unforgiving. I paused in folding napkins, a task Madison had assigned me because she claimed I needed to contribute something meaningful to my own party. Madison, you do realize this is supposed to be a celebration, not a photo shoot designed to hide my flaws. She finally looked up, her green eyes, the same shade as mine but somehow sharper, more calculating, widening in mock surprise. Liza, honey, I'm just trying to help. You know how important first impressions are, and with Derek's family coming, she trailed off, but the implication hung heavy between us. Derek's family, the Whitmore family of Whitmore and Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, the family that had produced 3 generations of federal judges, 2 congressmen, and enough old money to buy half of Lake Forest. The family that, according to Madison, was doing me an enormous favor by allowing their youngest son to marry a 32-year-old insurance claims investigator from the South Side. Derek loves me exactly as I am, I said quietly, returning to the napkins. He's not marrying me for my photo angles. Madison's laugh was light but held an edge I'd learned to recognize over the years. Of course he does, sweetie. I just think it's wonderful that you finally found someone. After all those years of being alone, all those family dinners where you'd show up by yourself while everyone else brought dates. She paused, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when delivering what she considered profound wisdom. I mean, we were all starting to wonder if you'd ever find anyone willing to settle down with you. The words hit like they always did. That familiar sting of being perpetually categorized as the family's romantic failure. At 32, I was the oldest unmarried cousin in a family where wedding announcements arrived with the regularity of birthday cards. Madison had married her college boyfriend at 24 in a ceremony that had taken 2 years to plan and cost more than my annual salary. Our cousin Ashley had followed with a destination wedding in Tuscany. Even our baby cousin Sarah, barely 26, had just gotten engaged to her law school classmate. And then there was me, Liza Hartford, the one who brought store-bought dessert to family gatherings while everyone else arrived with homemade contributions and +1s. The one who consistently drew the short straw for seating arrangements, always placed at the kids' table or next to Great Uncle Raymond, who spent every dinner explaining his conspiracy theories about municipal parking meters. I wasn't looking to be settled for, I said, focusing intently on creating perfect creases in the paper napkins. I was looking for the right person. And you found him. Madison's voice brightened with what I'd learned to recognize as her particular brand of conditional enthusiasm. Derek is such a catch. Harvard Law, that gorgeous brownstone in Lincoln Park, and his family. God, Liza. Do you know how many women would kill for this opportunity? Opportunity. The word sat heavy in my chest, reducing my relationship to a business transaction, my feelings to a lucky break in a game I hadn't realized I was losing so badly. I had met Derek Whitmore 8 months ago at a coffee shop in River North, where I'd been reviewing case files for a particularly complex insurance fraud investigation. He'd been at the next table, struggling with what appeared to be a brief that had exploded across the small surface, papers scattered and coffee dangerously close to important documents. When a sudden gust from the opening door sent his papers flying, I'd helped him gather them, my investigative training making me naturally methodical in collecting and organizing the scattered pages. "You're a lifesaver," he'd said, his smile genuine and warm. "I'm Derek, and I owe you at least a coffee for preventing a complete disaster." Derek was handsome in an understated way, with sandy brown hair that never quite stayed perfectly styled and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wasn't the type to turn heads when he walked into a room, but he had something more valuable: an easy laugh, genuine curiosity about other people, and the rare ability to listen without immediately trying to solve whatever problem you were sharing. Our first date had been dinner at a small Italian place in Little Italy, the kind of restaurant that Madison would have dismissed as quaint but that felt perfectly right to me. Derek had asked about my work with genuine interest, listening as I explained the intricacies of insurance fraud investigation, the puzzle-solving aspects that I loved, the satisfaction of uncovering the truth in situations where nothing was quite what it seemed. "It's like being a detective," he'd said, leaning forward with the kind of engaged attention I wasn't used to receiving. "You're looking for patterns, inconsistencies, things that don't add up." "Exactly," I'd replied, surprised by how easily the conversation flowed. "Most people think it's boring paperwork, but there's real detective work involved. Following paper trails, interviewing witnesses, analyzing financial records. I love the challenge of it." Derek nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like you're really good at seeing what other people miss." The comment had stayed with me because it felt like recognition of something I'd always known about myself but rarely heard acknowledged. In my family, my analytical nature was often dismissed as overthinking, my attention to detail characterized as being nitpicky. But Derek saw it as a strength, a professional asset that translated into success in my career. Over the following months, our relationship had developed with a comfortable steadiness that felt revolutionary after years of dating men who either disappeared after a few weeks or treated me like a placeholder until something better came along. Derek introduced me to his friends, invited me to work events, and never once made me feel like he was doing me a favor by being seen with me. Which made Madison's current commentary all the more grating. "Have you given any thought to what you'll wear to the party?" Madison continued, settling onto my couch with the air of someone preparing for a lengthy consultation. "I was thinking about that navy dress you wore to Sarah's engagement party, but with some adjustments, maybe a different neckline, something that's a bit more flattering for your figure." I set down the napkins more forcefully than necessary. "Madison, what exactly are you trying to say?" She blinked innocently, an expression she'd perfected in childhood and wielded like a weapon ever since. "I'm just saying that Derek's family will be there, and first impressions matter. His mother is very sophisticated, she'll notice details." Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. I'd met Derek's mother twice, both times at carefully orchestrated family dinners where I'd felt like I was being interviewed for a position I wasn't sure I wanted. She was the type of woman who could make you feel underdressed in a designer gown, who spoke in perfectly modulated tones that somehow managed to convey disapproval without saying anything explicitly critical. "Derek's mother likes me," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't entirely convinced of their truth. "Of course she does," Madison agreed quickly. "I just think she'll appreciate seeing you make an effort. You know how important family approval is for men like Derek." Men like Derek. The phrase bothered me, reducing my boyfriend to a category, a type to be managed and impressed rather than a person who'd chosen me for reasons that had nothing to do with my ability to impress his mother. "Derek isn't marrying his mother," I pointed out. "He's marrying me." Madison's smile faltered slightly. "Well, yes, obviously. I just think, Liza, this is a really big deal. Derek is offering you something most women our age would give anything for: a stable future, financial security, a place in one of Chicago's best families. I just want to make sure you don't do anything to mess it up." The words hung between us, and I felt that familiar twist in my stomach that came with Madison's particular brand of concern. It was always framed as help, as sisterly love, but it carried an underlying message that I was perpetually on the verge of sabotaging my own happiness through some fundamental inadequacy. "I'm not going to mess anything up," I said quietly. "Derek loves me." "Of course he does," Madison replied automatically. "I just think it's wonderful that you finally have the chance to have what the rest of us have had. A real partnership, a proper family life. You've been alone for so long, it must feel amazing to finally have someone who wants to build a life with you." The words should have felt supportive, but instead they reinforced the narrative that had followed me through family gatherings for years, that my single status was a problem to be solved, a deficit to be remedied, rather than simply a life circumstance that didn't require commentary or fixing. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. I thought about the conversation Derek and I had had just the night before, lying in bed in his Lincoln Park brownstone, talking about our plans for the weekend. Not grand plans for our future or discussions about wedding details, just the comfortable intimacy of two people who enjoyed each other's company, planning to spend Saturday morning at the farmer's market and Sunday afternoon reading in Lincoln Park. "I love how quiet you get when you're thinking," he'd said, tracing patterns on my shoulder. "It's like I can see your brain working, organizing thoughts into neat little categories." It was the kind of observation that came from really knowing someone, from paying attention to their habits and finding them endearing rather than annoying. Derek noticed things about me that no one else ever had. The way I organized my bookshelf, not just alphabetically, but by genre and publication date. How I always checked the locks twice before leaving the apartment. The particular expression I got when I was solving a complex case at work. "Earth to Liza," Madison's voice cut through my thoughts. "You're doing that thing again where you disappear into your own head. Derek's going to have to get used to that, I suppose." The casual dismissal of one of the traits Derek actually loved about me crystallized something I'd been trying to ignore for weeks. Madison's enthusiasm for my engagement wasn't really about my happiness. It was about the relief of finally being able to categorize me as successfully coupled, to stop worrying about what my perpetual singleness said about our family, to present a united front of successful Hartford women at family gatherings. "Madison," I said carefully, "why do you think Derek is with me?" She looked surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what do you think he sees in me? What draws him to me specifically?" Madison's pause was just a beat too long, her smile a fraction too bright. "Well, you're very reliable and loyal. Men appreciate that, and you're smart, of course. Derek probably likes having someone who can keep up with his work intellectually. Reliable, loyal, the kind of qualities you'd list for a good employee or a faithful dog, not the passionate love of your life." I waited for her to mention something about my personality, my sense of humor, the way Derek and I could talk for hours about everything and nothing, but the additional comments never came. "Plus," Madison continued, warming to her theme, "you're at the perfect age to settle down. You're mature enough to appreciate what he's offering, and you won't be distracted by all the game playing that younger women do. Derek probably likes knowing that you're serious about commitment." The conversation felt surreal, as if we were discussing a business arrangement rather than a relationship built on genuine affection and compatibility. I thought about the way Derek looked at me when I was explaining a particularly interesting case, the pride in his voice when he introduced me to his colleagues, the comfortable silence we could share over Sunday morning coffee. "What about love?" I asked quietly. Madison blinked. "What about it? Do you think Derek loves me? Really loves me? Not just appreciates my reliability and maturity?" "Of course he loves you," Madison said, but her voice carried that automatic quality of someone providing the expected response rather than expressing a genuine belief. Why else would he propose? The question echoed in my head as I resumed folding napkins, each crease sharp and precise. Why else would he propose? As if love were so unlikely an explanation that we needed to search for more practical motivations. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Can't wait to celebrate with you Saturday. My parents are excited to welcome you to the family officially." I stared at the message, trying to reconcile the warmth I felt reading his words with the cold analysis Madison had just provided of our relationship. Derek's texts were always like this: straightforward, affectionate, free of the kind of calculated charm that had characterized my previous relationships with men who were always performing rather than simply being themselves. "Is that Derek?" Madison asked, peering over my shoulder. "What does he say about the party?" I showed her the text, and she smiled with satisfaction. See? His parents are excited. That's such a good sign, Liza. You should be proud of yourself for landing someone whose family actually wants to claim you. Landing someone. As if Derek were a prize I'd won rather than a person I'd fallen in love with. The language Madison used consistently framed my relationship as an achievement unlocked, a goal accomplished, rather than a partnership between two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. I should get going, I said, suddenly needing space to process the conversation. I have some case files to review before Monday. Madison nodded approvingly. That's smart. Derek probably appreciates that you're so dedicated to your work. It shows you're not just waiting around for him to support you financially. The comment stung because it revealed how Madison saw me, as someone whose professional success was valuable primarily as evidence that I wouldn't be a burden to my future husband. My career wasn't an achievement in its own right, but a reassuring quality that made me a more attractive marriage prospect. After Madison left, I sat in my quiet apartment, looking around at the space I'd carefully curated over the years. My bookshelves are lined with mystery novels and true crime accounts, the small desk where I worked on complex cases, the kitchen where I experimented with recipes from different cuisines. It was the home of someone who'd built a life she enjoyed, not someone who'd been marking time until a man arrived to give her existence meaning. But lately Madison's perspective seemed to be shared by our entire family. At last month's family dinner, Aunt Beverly had cornered me by the dessert table to express her relief that I'd finally found someone. Cousin Ashley had offered to give me advice on keeping a man interested after the honeymoon phase. Even my own mother had made comments about how wonderful it was that I wouldn't have to worry about ending up alone. The assumption underlying all these conversations was that my single status had been a source of worry, a problem requiring solution rather than simply a circumstance of my life. And now that Derek had proposed, everyone seemed to view my relationship as a rescue operation rather than a love story. I picked up my phone to call Derek, wanting to hear his voice, to remember what our relationship felt like when it wasn't being analyzed and categorized by well-meaning family members. But as I started to dial, I hesitated. What would I say? That my family saw our engagement as charity work? That they seemed to believe he was settling for me rather than choosing me? Instead, I set the phone aside and returned to the case files spread across my dining table. Work had always been my refuge, the place where my analytical mind was appreciated rather than criticized, where my attention to detail was a professional asset rather than a personality quirk to be managed. The current case involved a suspicious house fire in Evanston, with insurance claims that didn't quite align with the physical evidence. The homeowner claimed to have lost family heirlooms worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the photos provided showed damage patterns that didn't match the supposed intensity of the blaze. It was the kind of puzzle I loved solving, where careful analysis could reveal the truth hidden beneath surface appearances. As I worked organizing evidence and tracking inconsistencies, I found myself thinking about Madison's comments and wondering if I was missing something obvious about my own life. Was I so desperate for love that I was misreading Derek's motivations? Was our relationship actually the kind of settling arrangement Madison seemed to believe it was? But then I remembered the way Derek had proposed, 3 weeks ago during a quiet dinner at home. No elaborate production, no public spectacle, just the two of us and a ring he'd chosen because he'd noticed me admiring similar vintage settings in antique shop windows. He'd been nervous, stumbling over words as he tried to express how much our relationship meant to him, how he couldn't imagine his future without me in it. "I love how your mind works," he'd said, holding the ring with slightly shaking hands. "I love how you see patterns where other people see chaos, how you're patient with puzzles that would drive most people crazy. I love that you laugh at my terrible jokes and that you're genuinely interested in whatever book I'm reading, even when it's something incredibly boring about tax law." Those weren't the words of someone settling for a convenient option. They were the words of someone who'd been paying attention, who saw specific qualities in me that he valued and wanted to build a life around. So why did Madison's interpretation feel so convincing? Why did her casual dismissal of Derek's genuine affection carry more weight than my own experience of our relationship? The answer, I realized, lay in years of conditioning, years of being the single one at family gatherings, the one whose romantic life was constantly scrutinized and found wanting, years of well-meaning relatives offering advice on how to find someone, as if my singleness were a personal failing rather than a choice to wait for the right person. Madison wasn't trying to be cruel. In her mind, she was protecting me from disappointment by managing my expectations, ensuring I understood how lucky I was to have attracted someone of Derek's caliber. But her protection felt more like diminishment, reducing my relationship to a transaction rather than celebrating it as a love story. As I worked late into the evening, I made a decision. Saturday's engagement party would be exactly that, a celebration of Derek's and my decision to build a life together. Not a showcase of my successful capture of an appropriate husband, not a relief party for my family's long-standing concern about my romantic prospects, but a gathering of people who cared about us and wanted to celebrate our happiness. I had no idea that in 3 days that celebration would become the backdrop for revelations that would change everything my family thought they knew about me, about love, and about the assumptions they'd been making for years. The ring hidden in my jewelry box, the secret I'd been keeping for 6 months, would soon transform from a private joy into a public reckoning. But for now, in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by the work I loved and the life I'd built, I allowed myself to simply be happy about marrying a man who loved me exactly as I was. The first sign that something was wrong came Friday morning when I arrived at Derek's office to surprise him with lunch. I'd finished my morning depositions early and decided to pick up sandwiches from that deli he loved in the Loop. But as I approached the reception desk at Whitmore & Associates, I overheard a conversation that made me freeze behind a marble pillar. "Honestly, don't understand what Derek sees in her," a woman's voice was saying. I recognized it as Vanessa Chen, one of the junior partners. I mean, she's nice enough, but hardly what you'd expect for someone from his family. "Maybe that's exactly what he needs," replied Marcus Webb, another associate. "Someone low maintenance, no drama, no expensive tastes, no complications." "Low maintenance," Vanessa laughed. "Is that what we're calling it? I suppose there's something to be said for a woman who won't compete with his career or expect too much attention." My stomach clenched as I pressed myself against the cold marble, the bag of sandwiches heavy in my hands. They were talking about me like I was a practical choice, a sensible option rather than someone Derek had fallen in love with. "His mother certainly seems pleased with the arrangement," Marcus continued. "She was telling my wife at the charity luncheon how refreshing it is to have someone in the family who understands her place." Understands her place, the phrase echoed in my head as I quietly backed away from the reception area, abandoning my plan to surprise Derek. Instead, I found myself walking aimlessly through downtown Chicago, trying to process what I'd heard. When Derek called me that evening, his voice was warm and familiar. "Hey, how was your day? I thought I saw you near my building around lunch, but when I looked again, you were gone." "Just running errands," I said, not ready to confront what I'd overheard. "How was your day?" "Busy but good. Actually, I had lunch with my mother. She wanted to go over some details for tomorrow's party." Something in his tone made me pause. "What kind of details?" "Oh, you know how she is about events. Seating arrangements, that sort of thing. She's very excited about introducing you to some of the family friends who couldn't make it to our smaller gatherings." Family friends. I thought about the guest list Madison had shown me, filled with names I didn't recognize. The Ashfords, the Montagues, the Harrisons, all families that moved in the same social circles as the Whitmores, all people who would be evaluating Derek's choice of bride. "Derek," I said carefully, "what exactly did you and your mother discuss?" A slight pause. "Nothing dramatic. She just wants everything to be perfect for us. She mentioned that some of her friends are curious about your background, your work, that sort of thing. I told her you'd be happy to talk about your career." But there was something in his voice, a careful quality that hadn't been there before, as if he were choosing his words more deliberately than usual. "Did she have specific questions about my work?" "Well, she was wondering about the long-term prospects, whether you'd want to continue working after we're married, especially once we start thinking about children." The conversation felt rehearsed, as if Derek were delivering talking points rather than sharing a casual discussion with his mother. My investigative instincts, honed by years of spotting inconsistencies in insurance claims, began to activate. "And what did you tell her?" "That we haven't really discussed it in detail yet." Which reminded me, we probably should talk about that soon. I mean, my schedule is pretty demanding, and if we're going to have kids— He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Someone would need to be the primary caregiver, and given the importance of his career versus mine, that someone would presumably be me. "Derek, do you remember what you said when you proposed? About loving how my mind works, how I see patterns where others see chaos?" "Of course I remember. Why? Do you still feel that way?" "About my work, I mean. What should I do?" Another pause, longer this time. "Liza, Where is this coming from? Did something happen today? I almost told him about overhearing his colleagues about the casual dismissal of our relationship as a practical arrangement. But something held me back. Instead, I said, I just want to make sure we're on the same page about our future. We are, he said, but the reassurance felt automatic rather than genuine. Listen, I should probably get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and my mother has me running around handling last-minute details. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The Derek I'd fallen in love with didn't defer to his mother's opinions about our relationship. He'd never suggested that my career was something we needed to discuss in terms of its long-term viability, and he'd certainly never spoken about our future as if major decisions had already been made without my input. Saturday morning brought a flurry of activity. Madison arrived at my apartment at 8 a.m. sharp, armed with a garment bag, makeup case, and an energy that felt more military operation than celebration preparation. I brought the navy dress we discussed, she announced, hanging the bag in my bedroom, but I also brought a backup option, something a little more appropriate for the venue. The backup option turned out to be a conservative black dress with three-quarter sleeves and a neckline that practically reached my collarbone. It was the kind of dress you'd wear to a funeral or a very serious business meeting. Madison, this is an engagement party, not a wake. I know, but I was thinking about Derek's family, and you want to make the right impression. Sophisticated, serious, wife material. Wife material. Another phrase that reduced me to a collection of desirable qualities rather than a whole person. What's wrong with the navy dress? I asked, pulling it from the garment bag. It was a dress I'd worn before and felt confident in, flattering but not flashy, professional but still feminine. Madison pursed her lips. It's fine, but maybe a little too attention-grabbing. You don't want to overshadow Derek at his own party. I stared at her. Madison, it's our engagement party. We're supposed to be the center of attention. Well, yes, but you know what I mean. Derek should be the focus. You're there to support him, to show everyone what a good choice he's made. The conversation was taking on a surreal quality, as if Madison were coaching me for a job interview rather than helping me prepare for a celebration of my engagement. Every suggestion she made seemed designed to minimize my presence rather than enhance it. Has Derek's mother said something to you? I asked directly. Madison's eyes widened innocently. What would she have said? I barely know her. But there was something in her expression, a flicker of guilt that my investigative training caught immediately. Madison was many things, but she wasn't a skilled liar. Growing up, I'd always been able to tell when she'd been the one who'd broken Mom's favorite vase or eaten the last piece of cake. Madison, okay, fine. She might have called yesterday, just to coordinate a few things. What kind of things? Nothing major, just making sure we were all on the same page about the tone of the event. She wanted to ensure everything would be appropriate. The word hung between us like a challenge. Appropriate how? Madison busied herself with arranging makeup brushes, avoiding my eyes. You know how these society families are. They have certain expectations about behavior, presentation, that sort of thing. Mrs. Whitmore just wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable navigating that environment. And she thought I might not be. She didn't say that exactly. She mentioned that some of Derek's father's law partners would be there, and they can be a little formal. She suggested maybe keeping the conversation focused on safe topics, such as, hobbies, travel, maybe some stories about how you and Derek met. Nothing too detailed about work stuff that might be hard for people to relate to. I felt a chill run down my spine. She told you to tell me not to talk about my work. Not exactly not to talk about it, just maybe not to get too technical. Some people find insurance fraud investigations a little intense for party conversation. The manipulation was becoming clearer. Mrs. Whitmore had orchestrated this conversation through Madison, using my sister's eagerness to help as a way to deliver instructions about how I should present myself. It was subtle but unmistakable, a way of managing my behavior without having to make direct requests that might offend. What else did she suggest? Madison's discomfort was growing more obvious. Liza, she's just trying to help. She wants you to feel confident and comfortable. What else, Madison? A sigh. She mentioned that some of Derek's colleagues might ask about your background, your family, that sort of thing. She suggested maybe emphasizing the positive aspects, as opposed to the negative aspects. You know what I mean, maybe mentioning that Dad's accounting firm is well established, that you went to Northwestern, that sort of thing. Professional credentials. What Madison wasn't saying was as revealing as what she was. Mrs. Whitmore wanted me to emphasize the middle-class respectability of my background while avoiding any details that might highlight the social distance between our families. My father's small accounting practice was well established, but it wasn't Whitmore and Associates. My Northwestern degree was prestigious, but it wasn't Harvard Law. Did she have any other suggestions? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. Madison hesitated. She might have mentioned that it would be nice if you seemed grateful. For Derek's choice, I mean. Some of her friends have daughters who've had their eye on him for years. And there it was. The real message underlying all the careful coaching. I was supposed to present myself as appropriately grateful for Derek's attention, humble about my good fortune in attracting someone of his caliber, and careful not to do anything that might suggest I was taking his interest for granted. The phone rang, interrupting my growing anger. It was Derek, calling from the country club. Hey, I'm here early helping with setup. How are things going on your end? Fine, I said, watching Madison pretend to be absorbed in arranging my jewelry. Just getting ready. Great. Listen, I should probably mention that a few more people got added to the guest list last minute. Some family friends of my parents who were in town unexpectedly. Anyone I should know about? Just some people from my dad's firm. A few of my mother's charity board colleagues. Nothing to worry about. But I was starting to worry. Every conversation felt like another layer of expectation being added, another way in which this party was becoming less about celebrating our relationship and more about presenting me for approval to Derek's social circle. Derek, can I ask you something? Of course. When you think about our future together, what are you most excited about? The question seemed to catch him off guard. What do you mean? I mean, what aspects of building a life together make you happiest? What are you looking forward to? A pause. Well, I guess, having a partner, someone to come home to, someone who understands the demands of my work, someone to build something stable with. The answer was perfectly reasonable, but it felt generic. He could have been describing the benefits of marriage in general, rather than specifically his excitement about marrying me. What about me specifically? I pressed. What do you love about the idea of being married to me? Another pause. Longer this time. Liza, is everything okay? You seem… I don't know, it's different today. I wanted to tell him about overhearing his colleagues, about his mother's instructions delivered through Madison, about my growing sense that our engagement was being treated as a social arrangement rather than a love story. But something held me back. I'm fine, I said. Just pre-party nerves, I guess. Well, don't be nervous. Everyone's going to love you. The phrase echoed in my head after we hung up. Everyone's going to love you. Not I can't wait for everyone to see how amazing you are, or I'm excited to show off the woman I'm crazy about. Just the bland assurance that I would be acceptable to his social circle. Madison had been watching me throughout the phone call, and now she approached with the careful expression of someone about to deliver difficult advice. Liza, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you seem a little tense about today. Is there something you want to talk about? Do you think Derek loves me? I asked directly. Madison blinked, clearly not expecting such a blunt question. Of course he loves you. Why would you ask that? I really love you. Not just thinks I'm a suitable choice for a wife, but actually loves me specifically. Liza, where is this coming from? Derek proposed to you. He's throwing you this party. He's introducing you to his family and friends. What more proof do you need? But that was exactly the problem. Everything Madison listed were actions Derek might take for any woman he'd decided to marry. None of them were things he'd do specifically because he was in love with me as an individual. Madison, when you met James, how did you know he loved you? My sister's expression softened. Well, he was always doing little things that showed he was thinking about me. He'd bring me coffee made exactly the way I liked it, or he'd mention something I'd said weeks earlier that I didn't even remember telling him. He seemed to really see me, you know? Not just as a girlfriend, but as me specifically. The description made my chest tight. Derek did some of those things, but lately it felt like his attention was more focused on managing the logistics of our relationship than on the actual emotional connection between us. Has Derek ever told you what he loves about me? I asked. Madison's pause was telling. He's mentioned that you're very steady, reliable, that you don't create drama or complications. Steady, reliable, no drama, the same qualities his colleagues had mentioned, the same practical benefits his mother seemed to appreciate, but none of them were about me as a person, about the specific qualities that made me unique or lovable. Madison, do you think there's any chance that Derek is marrying me because I'm convenient rather than because he's in love with me? My sister's face went through several expressions before settling on forced brightness. Liza, honey, I think you're overthinking this. Derek is a good man from a good family, and he's chosen you. That's what matters. But her non-answer was an answer. Madison couldn't point to evidence of Derek's passionate love for me because she hadn't seen any. Like everyone else, she saw our engagement as a practical arrangement that happened to work out well for both parties. The realization hit me like a physical blow. For months I'd been building a future with someone who might not actually be in love with me, but rather with the idea of me as a suitable wife, and everyone around us, my family, his colleagues, saw our relationship the same way. As Madison returned to her preparations chattering about hair and makeup, I found myself thinking about a case I'd worked on 6 months ago. A woman had claimed her husband had died in a car accident, but the evidence didn't support her story. The physical damage to the vehicle didn't match the supposed impact pattern, the timeline didn't align with witness statements, and the insurance policy had been increased significantly just weeks before the incident. Everyone around the woman, her family, her friends, her neighbors, had believed her story because it seemed plausible on the surface. A tragic accident, a grieving widow, a straightforward insurance claim, but when I dug deeper, pattern by pattern, inconsistency by inconsistency, the truth emerged. The accident had been staged, the death was intentional, and the woman had been collecting insurance money based on an elaborate deception. Now I found myself wondering if I was living in a similar situation. Was our engagement the emotional equivalent of insurance fraud, a carefully constructed fiction that looked real on the surface but couldn't withstand close examination? The thought was so disturbing that I almost dismissed it entirely, but my professional training had taught me never to ignore inconsistencies just because I didn't like what they might reveal. As the morning progressed and the party drew closer, I made a decision. Today, I would pay attention. Really pay attention. The way I did when investigating a suspicious claim. I would watch Derek's behavior, listen to his words, observe how he interacted with me in front of his family and friends. I would look for evidence of genuine love, rather than simply assuming it existed. I had no idea that this decision would lead me to discoveries that would change everything I thought I knew about my relationship, my family, and myself. The secret I'd been carrying for 6 months, the platinum ring hidden in my jewelry box, would soon become the key to understanding truths that went far deeper than anyone at that party could have imagined. But for now, as Madison fussed over my appearance and coached me on appropriate conversation topics, I prepared to attend my own engagement party with the analytical eye of an investigator rather than the trusting heart of a woman in love. The Riverside Country Club's ballroom was a study in understated elegance, all cream-colored linens and crystal chandeliers, the kind of venue that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. As Madison and I arrived for the final setup, I found myself cataloging details the way I would at an investigation site, looking for patterns and inconsistencies that might reveal hidden truths. Derek was across the room, deep in conversation with his father and 2 men I didn't recognize. They were standing near the bar, their body language creating an exclusive circle that seemed designed to keep others at a distance. When Derek noticed me, he waved but didn't break away from the group, simply mouthing 5 minutes before returning to his conversation. "Those are senior partners from the firm," Madison whispered, following my gaze. "Very important people. Derek's probably discussing business." But as I watched, I noticed something odd. The conversation didn't have the casual flow of colleagues catching up at a social event. Instead, Derek seemed to be reporting to the older men, his posture deferential in a way I'd never seen before. When one of them spoke, Derek nodded quickly, almost eagerly, like a student receiving instruction from professors. "Liza, there you are, darling." Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore appeared beside me with the kind of perfectly timed entrance that suggested she'd been watching for my arrival. She was dressed in understated pearl gray, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "You look lovely," she said, her eyes scanning my navy dress with what might have been approval. "Much better than I expected." The comment was delivered with a smile, but the words themselves were strange. Much better than she expected? Based on what? "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. The venue is beautiful. Please call me Eleanor. After all, we're going to be family." She paused, her gaze moving to the group of men around Derek. "I hope you understand how important today is for Derek's career. Many influential people will be here, and first impressions can have lasting impact. Of course, I replied, though something about her emphasis made me uncomfortable. Derek mentioned that some of his father's colleagues would be attending. Oh yes, quite a few. The Ashfords are here. Charles is on the federal appellate court. The Montagues arrived from Washington this morning. Helen is being considered for an ambassador position. Even the Harrisons made time in their schedule, and Senator Harrison rarely attends private events. She was listing credentials like a social scorecard, making it clear that my engagement party was doubling as a networking opportunity for Derek. Each name she dropped carried implicit weight, silent pressure about the kind of impression I needed to make. It's an honor to have such distinguished guests, I said carefully. Indeed, Derek is fortunate to have these relationships. They'll be crucial as he moves toward partnership and beyond. She paused meaningfully. Of course, a partner's wife plays an important role in maintaining these connections. Social obligations, charity work, the right kind of entertainment. The message was clear. My value as Derek's fiancée would be measured by my ability to help advance his career through social networking and appropriate behavior. I wasn't just marrying Derek. I was accepting a position in a complex social hierarchy that came with specific expectations and responsibilities. I'm sure Derek and I will figure out how to balance everything, I said diplomatically. Eleanor's smile sharpened slightly. Balance is exactly the right word. Derek's career must come first, naturally, but the right wife can be an enormous asset in helping him achieve his potential. Before I could respond, Derek finally broke away from his group and approached us, his expression bright but somehow strained. Mom, I hope you're not overwhelming Liza with family history, he said, placing a hand on my lower back in a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. Just getting acquainted, Eleanor replied smoothly. Liza and I were discussing the important role family plays in professional success. Derek's hand pressed slightly harder against my back. Well, we should probably start greeting the other guests. People are beginning to arrive. As Eleanor glided away to manage other aspects of the event, Derek turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. How are you feeling? Nervous? A little, I admitted. Your mother was just explaining how many important people would be here today. Something flickered across Derek's face. She means well. She just wants everything to be perfect. Perfect for whom? The question seemed to catch him off guard. For us, of course. For our future. But there was something rehearsed about his response, as if he'd been coached on how to handle potential concerns. My investigative instincts, now fully activated, caught the slight delay before he answered, the way his eyes didn't quite meet mine when he spoke. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and carefully orchestrated conversations. True to Eleanor's promise, the guest list read like a who's who of Chicago legal and political circles. Each introduction followed a similar pattern. Derek would present me with obvious pride, the guests would smile politely and ask about my background, and I would deliver the sanitized version of my life story that Madison and Eleanor had helped me prepare. But as the conversations accumulated, I began to notice troubling patterns. When I mentioned my work in insurance fraud investigation, people's expressions would shift subtly, not quite dismissive, but clearly categorizing my career as less significant than Derek's legal work. When someone asked about my family, Derek would quickly interject with comments about my father's accounting firm, emphasizing its stability and respectability while glossing over any details that might highlight class differences. Most disturbing was Derek's behavior throughout these interactions. He seemed to be managing my presentation rather than simply introducing me as his fiancée. When I started to tell an engaging story about a recent case, he would gently redirect the conversation. When someone asked about my interests, he would answer for me, describing hobbies and preferences that sounded reasonable but weren't entirely accurate. Liza loves classical music, he told Judge Ashford, though I'd actually expressed preference for jazz during our early dates. She's very culturally sophisticated. Liza is wonderfully low maintenance, he assured Mrs. Montague when she asked about wedding planning. She's not the type to want an elaborate production. Each mischaracterization was small, the kind of social smoothing that might seem harmless in isolation, but together they painted a picture of someone Derek wanted me to be rather than who I actually was. The breaking point came when I overheard a conversation in the ladies' room. I was in a stall when two women entered, their voices carrying clearly in the marble-tiled space. Well, she's certainly not what I expected, one voice said. I recognized it as Mrs. Harrison, the senator's wife. Eleanor said she was very practical, replied the other woman. I suppose that's exactly what Derek needs at this point in his career. Practical, yes. Though I have to say, she seems a bit overwhelmed by all this. Did you see her face when Charles was discussing the judicial nomination process? Completely lost. Eleanor mentioned that her background is quite different from Derek's. Apparently the family is middle class, nothing scandalous but certainly not our usual circle. Well, as long as she doesn't embarrass him at firm events, I suppose it could work out. Derek is such a promising young man, it would be a shame if marriage held him back. Oh, I don't think there's any danger of that. Eleanor has made it very clear what's expected. And honestly, the girl seems grateful enough for the opportunity that she's unlikely to cause problems. Grateful for the opportunity. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I sat frozen in the stall, listening to these women discuss my relationship as if I were a business acquisition rather than Derek's chosen partner. When they left, I remained hidden, processing what I'd heard. The women weren't being malicious. They were simply discussing Derek's engagement the way they might analyze any strategic decision. My worth was being measured by my potential to help or hinder his career advancement. My gratitude assumed based on the social elevation the marriage would provide. But most disturbing was the implication that Eleanor had been discussing me with these women, providing background information and setting expectations about my behavior. My engagement wasn't just being celebrated, it was being evaluated by Derek's professional community as a career move. When I emerged from the restroom, I found Derek networking with a group of younger associates from his firm. They were discussing recent cases, partnership tracks, and firm politics with the kind of insider knowledge that came from shared ambition and similar backgrounds. "Liza," Derek called when he saw me approaching. "Come meet some of my colleagues. The associates. All Harvard or Yale graduates. All from families with connections to legal or political power, were polite but clearly saw me as peripheral to their real interests." When Derek mentioned my work, one of them made a joke about hunting down insurance cheats, and the others laughed in a way that felt more dismissive than friendly. "It must be interesting work," said Jennifer Walsh, a junior partner who looked like she'd stepped out of a legal thriller casting call. "Very methodical." The pause before methodical suggested she was searching for a diplomatic way to say boring. Derek quickly changed the subject to a recent Supreme Court decision, and I found myself standing silently while they debated constitutional law with the passionate intensity of people who lived and breathed legal theory. As I listened, I realized this was Derek's real world, not the quiet dinners and weekend farmers market visits we'd shared, but this competitive arena of ambitious professionals who measured success by billable hours and partnership prospects. In this environment, I wasn't Derek's intellectual equal or romantic partner. I was a pleasant addition to his personal life who wouldn't interfere with his professional goals. The realization crystallized when Derek's phone buzzed during the conversation. He glanced at it, then looked at me apologetically. "I need to take this quickly, client emergency." "You don't mind, do you?" Before I could answer, he was already stepping away, leaving me with his colleagues. The conversation immediately became more relaxed, as if Derek's absence had removed some invisible pressure. "You're very patient," Jennifer observed. "Derek's schedule can be brutal. Lots of women wouldn't tolerate the long hours and last-minute cancellations." "It comes with the territory," I replied neutrally. "Exactly the right attitude," said Marcus Webb, whom I recognized from the conversation I'd overheard at Derek's office. "Derek needs someone who understands that his career has to come first, at least for the next few years while he's making partner." The casual assumption that Derek's career would automatically take priority over mine was stunning. Not discussed, not negotiated, but simply accepted as natural order. "What about your work?" asked another associate whose name I'd missed. "Will you keep doing the insurance thing after you're married?" The insurance thing, as if my career were a hobby rather than a profession I'd built over 8 years. "I love my work," I said firmly. "I plan to continue it." Jennifer exchanged a glance with Marcus. "That's admirable. Though I imagine Derek's schedule doesn't leave much time for two demanding careers. Someone has to handle the household management, social obligations, family planning." The list of responsibilities was delivered as if these duties would naturally fall to me, regardless of my own professional commitments. The assumption was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it revealed how Derek's world viewed marriage. The wife's role was to support the husband's career while managing everything else that might interfere with his professional focus. When Derek returned from his call, he seemed energized rather than apologetic about the interruption. "Sorry about that. Johnson & Associates needed some clarification on the merger documents. Where were we?" "Just getting to know Liza better." Jennifer said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was telling us about her plans to continue working after the wedding. Derek's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Well, we'll see how things develop. A lot depends on our other priorities. Other priorities? Another euphemism for the assumption that my career would be sacrificed to accommodate his needs and timeline. As the afternoon progressed, I began to see the engagement party with the clarity that came from treating it as an investigation rather than a celebration. The guest list wasn't random, it was carefully curated to include people who could advance Derek's career. The conversations weren't casual social interactions, they were networking opportunities designed to strengthen professional relationships. And my role wasn't that of an equal partner being introduced to Derek's community. I was being presented for evaluation as a suitable addition to his social and professional portfolio. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed to test one more theory. During a quiet moment, I approached Eleanor, who was supervising the catering staff with military precision. "Eleanor, can I ask you something?" She turned to me with the polite attention of someone granting an audience. "Of course, dear. When Derek first told you about me, what was your reaction?" The question seemed to surprise her. My reaction? Were you excited that he'd found someone he cared about? Curious to meet the woman who'd made him happy? Eleanor's pause was telling. I was pleased that Derek was making mature decisions about his future. He's at an important stage in his career, and personal stability is crucial for professional success. Personal stability, not love, not happiness, not emotional fulfillment. Stability, as if I were a financial investment rather than a romantic partner. "Did you have specific concerns about me?" I pressed. Another pause, longer this time. I wanted to ensure that Derek's choice would complement his ambitions rather than complicate them. Marriage can be either an asset or a liability in professional advancement. The honesty was shocking in its coldness. Eleanor wasn't evaluating me as a potential daughter-in-law but as a strategic addition to Derek's career portfolio. My worth was measured entirely by my potential contribution to his professional success. "And what was your conclusion?" Eleanor's smile was cooler now, as if she'd decided I was asking inappropriate questions. "I believe you understand what's expected, Liza. Derek has enormous potential, and the right kind of support at home will be essential for him to achieve it." The conversation ended when Derek appeared, looking slightly frazzled. "The photographer wants to do some formal shots before people start leaving," he said. "Are you ready?" As we posed for pictures, Derek's arm around me, both of us smiling at the camera, I found myself thinking about the evidence I'd gathered. Every conversation, every interaction, every casual comment had pointed to the same conclusion. Derek wasn't marrying me because he was passionately in love with me. He was marrying me because I represented a safe, practical choice that wouldn't interfere with his professional ambitions. The realization should have been devastating, but instead, I felt the strange calm that came with solving a complex case. All the pieces fit together now, the inconsistencies finally making sense. Derek's recent behavior, his mother's coaching, his colleagues' assumptions, they all supported the theory that our engagement was more a business arrangement than a love story. But as the photographer directed us through various poses, I realized there was one more piece of evidence I needed to examine. Something I'd been hiding for 6 months, something that would either confirm my worst fears about Derek's motivations or completely upend everything I thought I understood about our relationship. The secret wedding ring in my jewelry box wasn't just a hidden symbol of a previous marriage. It was the key to understanding whether Derek loved me for who I really was, or for who he thought I was. And in a few hours, when Madison made her speech about finally finding someone willing to settle, that ring would reveal truths that would shock everyone in that ballroom. The investigation was nearly complete. Now I just had to decide whether I was ready for the answers I was about to uncover. The moment came during Madison's maid of honor speech, just as I'd feared it would. She stood at the microphone with practiced poise, her voice carrying across the ballroom filled with Derek's family, colleagues, and society connections. Every word she spoke felt like a needle pricking at the facade I'd been maintaining all afternoon. "I've watched my sister Liza navigate the dating world for years," Madison began, her tone warm but condescending. "She's always been so particular, so focused on her career, that frankly some of us worried she might be too independent for her own good." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. I felt Derek's hand find mine under the table, his grip surprisingly tight. "But Derek changed all that," Madison continued. He saw past Liza's let's call them defensive walls and recognized what a wonderful wife she would make. He was willing to be patient with someone who honestly didn't think she needed a man in her life. The words stung because they painted me as a charity case, someone who'd been rescued from spinsterhood by Derek's generous patience. But it was Madison's next comment that made my blood run cold. I mean, at 32, and with her track record of failed relationships, we were all starting to think Liza might never find someone willing to settle. Willing to settle. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt something inside me snap. Without conscious thought, my hand moved to twist the ring I'd been unconsciously fidgeting with throughout the entire party, the simple platinum band I'd kept hidden for 6 months. The movement caught the chandelier light, and suddenly Madison's voice faltered. Her eyes fixed on my left hand with growing confusion and shock. "Liza," she whispered into the microphone, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom, "is that what I think it is?" 200 faces turned toward me, the weight of their attention like a physical force. I looked down at the ring that had betrayed my secret, the ring that was about to change everything these people thought they knew about my life. "You're already married." Madison's voice cracked on the last word. The question exploded across the room like a detonation. I heard gasps, the scrape of chairs as people leaned forward, the sharp intake of breath from Eleanor Whitmore somewhere behind me, but it was Derek's reaction that cut deepest, the way his hand dropped mine as if I'd suddenly become toxic, the way he turned to stare at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Liza," his voice was barely a whisper. "What is she talking about?" The moment crystallized everything I'd discovered during my investigation. Derek's shock wasn't the reaction of a man whose beloved had been keeping a secret from him. It was the reaction of someone whose carefully planned arrangement had just been revealed as based on false premises. I stood slowly, my legs surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening around me. The ballroom had fallen into absolute silence. 200 people waiting for an explanation that would either restore order or destroy it completely. "Yes," I said clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm already married." The words hit like a bomb. Eleanor Whitmore made a sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. Several of Derek's colleagues exchanged shocked glances. Judge Ashford looked like he was witnessing a courtroom confession in a capital case. But it was Derek's face that held my attention. The confusion was giving way to something else. Not heartbreak, not betrayal, but calculation. He was already thinking about damage control, about how this revelation would affect his reputation, his career prospects, his standing with the people in this room. "That's impossible," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We've been together for 8 months. We've talked about everything. You can't be married." "I've been married for 3 years," I replied calmly. "To Michael Torres, a paramedic with the Chicago Fire Department. We eloped to Vegas after dating for 6 months, because we were young and impulsive and completely in love." The details hit the crowd like individual shockwaves. Michael Torres, not a name that would impress anyone in this room. A paramedic, noble work but hardly the kind of profession that would enhance Derek's social standing. Vegas elopement, the opposite of the sophisticated society wedding. Eleanor had probably already begun planning. "But you're engaged to Derek," Madison protested from the microphone, her voice reaching us clearly across the stunned ballroom. "You accepted his proposal. We're planning a wedding." "I accepted Derek's proposal," I said, "because I thought he knew." The lie was necessary, a momentary shield while I gathered the courage to reveal the deeper truth. But Derek seized on it immediately. "Knew what? How could I possibly have known you were married? You never mentioned a husband. You don't wear a wedding ring. You live alone. You act single. Because we're separated," I interrupted, the words coming easier now that the worst of the secret was out. "We have been for 6 months. Since before I met you." It wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough to the truth to be defensible. Michael and I had been having problems for months before our separation, struggling with his demanding schedule and my workaholic tendencies. The separation had been mutual, a chance to figure out whether we could make our marriage work or whether we'd been too young when we eloped. "Separated isn't divorced," Eleanor's voice cut across the room like a blade. She had recovered her composure and was now standing near the head table, her face a mask of controlled fury. "You've been lying to my son for 8 months." "I've been trying to figure out my life," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "Just like Derek has been trying to figure out his." The implication hung in the air, that Derek's engagement to me had been as calculated as my concealment of my marriage. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing undercurrents they didn't fully understand. Derek stood up, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Liza, we need to talk privately." "No," I said firmly. "I think we need to talk here in front of everyone, because I've spent this entire party listening to people discuss our relationship, and I think it's time for some honest conversation." Derek's eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of his colleagues, his family, the influential people whose opinions could affect his career. "This isn't the place. This is exactly the place," I interrupted, "because these people have been evaluating me all afternoon like I'm a business acquisition. Your mother has been coaching my behavior through my sister. Your colleagues have been discussing my suitability as a partner's wife, and you've been misrepresenting my interests and preferences to make me sound more appealing to your professional community." The accusations landed like physical blows. Derek's face went pale, then flushed red. I was just trying to help you feel comfortable." "You told Judge Ashford that I love classical music." "I hate classical music, Derek. You know I prefer jazz, but jazz isn't sophisticated enough for your crowd, is it?" Murmurs started around the room as people began to understand that they were witnessing more than just the revelation of a secret marriage. They were seeing the exposure of a relationship built on fundamental deceptions. "You told Mrs. Montague that I'm wonderfully low maintenance," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "You described me to your colleagues as someone who understands that your career comes first. You've been presenting me as the perfect lawyer's wife, someone who won't compete with your ambitions or create complications for your professional advancement." Derek opened his mouth to protest, but Eleanor spoke first. "And why shouldn't Derek's career come first?" she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions respected. "Derek has enormous potential. Any woman would be fortunate to support that kind of success. Any woman except one who's already married to someone else," I replied. "Someone who loves her exactly as she is, not as an improved version designed to complement his career." The words hit Derek like a slap. "You love him? This paramedic?" For the first time since the confrontation began, I hesitated. The truth was complicated. Michael and I had been struggling, our marriage strained by competing priorities and different visions of our future. The separation had been real, the problems genuine, but Derek's question forced me to examine my feelings with the same analytical clarity I'd applied to investigating our relationship. "I love him enough to want to fix what's broken between us," I said finally, "and I love myself enough not to pretend to be someone I'm not, just to make your family comfortable." The admission sent another shockwave through the crowd. Several of Derek's colleagues were already pulling out their phones, probably calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming a social disaster. Jennifer Walsh, the junior partner who'd questioned my career plans earlier, stood up abruptly. "I think perhaps we should give the family some privacy," she announced, her tone suggesting that everyone present should flee before being contaminated by association with this mess. But Judge Ashford, apparently fascinated by the courtroom drama unfolding before him, remained seated. "Actually, I'm curious about something," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting answers. "Miss Hartford, if you've been separated from your husband for 6 months, and you've been with Derek for 8 months, when exactly did your relationship with Derek begin?" The question was a trap, and I saw Derek's face go white as he realized the implication. The timeline suggested that I'd started dating Derek while still married, which would make me an adulteress in the eyes of this conservative crowd. "My marriage has been troubled for over a year," I said carefully. "Michael and I have been living essentially separate lives, even before the formal separation. We're both young, we married impulsively, and we've been growing in different directions." "But you never divorced," Eleanor pressed, sensing an opportunity to regain control of the narrative. "You've been living a lie, deceiving my son about your availability, manipulating him into a relationship under false pretenses." The accusation was serious enough to shift sympathy back toward Derek, and I saw him straighten as he realized his mother was providing him with a way to cast himself as the victim in this situation. "Actually," I said, turning to face Derek directly, "I think we should talk about manipulation and false pretenses, because I've spent today investigating our relationship the same way I investigate insurance fraud cases, and I've discovered some interesting patterns." Derek's confidence faltered. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you've been presenting me to your professional community as a carefully selected asset rather than as someone you're in love with. Your colleagues describe me as low maintenance and practical. Your mother evaluated me for my potential to complement your ambitions rather than for my personal qualities. Even your proposal was calculated. You chose a ring and setting designed to appeal to my analytical nature rather than expressing genuine romantic feeling. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Derek's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. More importantly, I continued, you've never once, in 8 months, asked me what I want from our relationship. You've assumed I should be grateful for your attention, honored by your family's conditional acceptance, and willing to reshape my entire life to support your career goals. Madison, still standing at the microphone, looked like she was watching a tennis match, her head turning between Derek and me as each revelation landed. When I overheard your colleagues this morning, they described our relationship as convenient for you. When I listened to your mother's friends in the bathroom, they discussed my background as if they were evaluating a job candidate. And when I've tried to share my professional accomplishments or interests, you've redirected conversations to safer topics that won't challenge your community's preconceptions. Derek finally found his voice. That's not fair, Liza. I've been trying to help you fit in, to make sure people see your best qualities. My best qualities? I interrupted. You mean the qualities that make me suitable as a lawyer's wife? My reliability, my lack of drama, my willingness to defer to your judgment? Those aren't my best qualities, Derek. They're the qualities that make me convenient for your purposes. The truth was spreading through the ballroom like ripples in a pond. People were beginning to understand that they had witnessed not just the revelation of a secret marriage, but the exposure of a relationship built on mutual self-deception and social ambition rather than genuine love. Eleanor stepped forward, her face a mask of controlled fury. This is outrageous. Derek has offered you everything: social position, financial security, a place in one of Chicago's finest families, and you've repaid his generosity with lies and betrayal. His generosity? I laughed, the sound surprising in its bitterness. Derek didn't choose me out of generosity, Eleanor. He chose me because I represented a safe option, someone grateful enough for his attention that I wouldn't challenge his priorities or compete with his ambitions. Someone whose middle-class background would make me appropriately deferential to his family's social position. The accusation hit its target. Eleanor's composure cracked, revealing the calculating coldness beneath her polished exterior. You have no idea what Derek could have offered you, she hissed. The opportunities, the connections, the lifestyle. Most women would give anything for what you've thrown away. Most women might, I agreed, but I'm not most women. I'm someone who's already married to a man who loves me for exactly who I am, not for who I might become with the right coaching and social positioning. The final revelation hung in the air like smoke. Around the ballroom, 200 guests sat in stunned silence, processing the complete destruction of what they had believed was a straightforward engagement celebration. Derek stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. The careful social architecture of his life was collapsing, and everyone who mattered to his professional future was witnessing the destruction. But as I looked around the room at the shocked faces, the whispered conversations, the phones being surreptitiously activated to spread news of the scandal, I felt something unexpected: relief. The truth was finally out, messy and complicated and socially destructive, but honest in a way that our entire relationship had never been. The investigation was complete, the evidence was overwhelming, and the confrontation that would change everything was just beginning. The silence that followed my final words was deafening. 200 people sat frozen in their chairs, champagne glasses halfway to lips, conversations suspended mid-sentence. It was the kind of silence that precedes an avalanche, heavy, pregnant with potential destruction, and utterly unstoppable once it begins. Derek was the first to move, stepping back from me as if I'd become physically dangerous. His face had gone through shock, anger, and embarrassment to settle on something worse: cold calculation. I could practically see him running damage control scenarios in his head, measuring the professional cost of this public humiliation. Ladies and gentlemen, Eleanor's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She had recovered her composure with remarkable speed, her social training taking over in crisis mode. I think perhaps we should adjourn this gathering. Obviously there are private family matters that need to be addressed. But Judge Ashford remained seated, his legal mind apparently fascinated by the unfolding drama. Actually, I'd like to hear more about this investigation Ms. Hartford mentioned. As someone who's dealt with fraud cases, I'm curious about what patterns she identified. The question was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Derek shot the judge a look of pure panic, but it was too late. The legal community's interest was piqued, and they wanted details. Judge Ashford, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. The patterns were remarkably similar to insurance fraud cases I've investigated. Surface-level plausibility, hiding deeper deceptions, documents and statements that looked legitimate until examined closely, and most importantly, motivations that weren't what they appeared to be. For instance, Senator Harrison's wife leaned forward, apparently deciding this was better than any courtroom drama she'd ever witnessed. Derek's face was turning an alarming shade of red. Liza, please, don't do this here. But I was past caring about social niceties or protecting Derek's reputation. 8 months of careful analysis was demanding expression. For instance, Derek told me he loved how my mind worked, how I saw patterns where others saw chaos, but every time I applied those analytical skills to our relationship or his social circle, he redirected my attention. He encouraged my investigative abilities in the abstract while discouraging me from investigating anything that might reveal uncomfortable truths. Jennifer Walsh, who had been edging toward the exit, stopped dead. What kind of uncomfortable truths? The fact that his colleagues discussed our relationship in terms of professional advancement rather than personal happiness. The fact that his mother evaluated me based on my potential to enhance Derek's career rather than my compatibility with her son. The fact that every conversation about our future assumed my career would be subordinated to his ambitions. Madison finally found her voice from behind the microphone. But Liza, that's normal. When people get married, someone's career usually takes priority. Derek's just happens to be more important. More important according to whom? I turned to face my sister, who was still clutching the microphone like a lifeline. More important because he makes more money? Because his family has better connections? Because his profession is more prestigious? Madison's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Around the room, several wives of Derek's colleagues shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own life choices in my questions. More important because it has greater potential, Eleanor interjected, her voice sharp with authority. Derek is on track to become a federal judge, possibly even Supreme Court material. That kind of career requires sacrifices from both partners. Sacrifices like pretending to be someone you're not? I asked. Like hiding your real interests because they don't fit the image? Like accepting that your own professional achievements will always be secondary? You want to know the truth, Liza? Fine. Yes, I chose you because you seemed like you'd be a good partner for my career. You're smart enough to hold your own in conversation but not threatening enough to overshadow me. You're successful enough to be respectable but not so successful that you'd prioritize your work over our family. You're attractive but not so beautiful that other men would constantly compete for your attention. The brutal honesty hit the room like a physical blow. Several people actually gasped. Madison dropped the microphone, which hit the floor with a screech of feedback that perfectly captured the emotional chaos of the moment. But Derek wasn't finished. The dam had broken, and months of carefully controlled social performance was flooding out in a torrent of unfiltered truth. You want to know what I loved about you? I loved that you were grateful. Grateful for my attention, grateful to be included in my world, grateful for the opportunity to marry into a family with real social standing. I loved that you didn't have unrealistic expectations about romance or grand gestures. You understood that marriage is a partnership, a practical arrangement between compatible people. Each word was like a slap, but also strangely liberating. This was the real Derek, the one I'd been glimpsing in fragments throughout our relationship. Not the charming man who'd swept me off my feet, but the calculating professional who saw marriage as another strategic decision. And you know what? Derek continued, his voice rising. It would have worked perfectly if you hadn't been lying about the most basic fact of your availability. We could have had a good life together, a successful partnership that benefited both of us. But you destroyed that with your deception. My deception? The laugh that escaped me was harsh and bitter. Derek, you just admitted that our entire relationship was based on your calculation about my suitability as a professional asset. How is that different from fraud? Because I was honest about my intentions, Derek shot back. I never pretended to be something I wasn't. I never lied about my background or marital status or, you lied about loving me. The words hung in the air like an accusation in a murder trial. Derek's face went white, then red, then white again. I did love you, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I do love you, just not the way you apparently needed to be loved. You loved the idea of me, I corrected. You loved having a suitable fiancé who enhanced your social position without complicating your professional goals. You never loved me as an individual person with my own desires and ambitions." Around the room, conversations were breaking out in whispers as people processed what they were witnessing. Some of Derek's colleagues were already heading for the exits, clearly wanting to distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming a career-damaging scandal. Others seemed transfixed by the spectacle, unable to look away from the complete implosion of what they'd thought was a perfectly planned social arrangement. Eleanor stepped between Derek and me, her composure cracking further with each passing moment. "This is quite enough," she declared, her voice shaking with fury. "Derek, we're leaving. Immediately." But Derek shook his head, his expression hardening. "No, Mother. I want to finish this." He turned back to me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw the real person behind the careful social facade. Not the charming suitor or the ambitious young lawyer, but someone capable of genuine cruelty when his plans were threatened. "You want to talk about deception, Liza? Let's talk about how you manipulated me for 8 months. How you let me introduce you to my family, my colleagues, my friends, all while you were married to someone else. How you accepted my proposal, let me plan our future, allowed my family to invest emotionally and financially in our wedding, all while living a lie." His words carried weight because they contained truth. I had deceived him even if my motivations were more complicated than simple manipulation. "You're right," I said quietly. "I should have told you about Michael from the beginning. I was trying to figure out my marriage, and I was selfish to involve you in that process without your knowledge." The admission seemed to surprise Derek, as if he'd expected me to continue fighting rather than acknowledging my own failures. "But Derek," I continued, "my deception was about my circumstances. Yours was about your feelings. I lied about being separated because I was trying to protect myself while I figured out my life. You lied about loving me because it served your professional ambitions. I never lied about loving you. You just admitted that you chose me like you'd choose a business partner. You evaluated my qualities based on how they'd serve your career goals. You loved that I was grateful and had realistic expectations about romance. Those aren't the words of someone who's genuinely in love." Madison, who had retrieved the microphone and was now standing uncertainly at the front of the room, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should all take a step back," she suggested, her voice shaky. "This is getting very personal very quickly." "It was always personal, Madison," I replied without taking my eyes off Derek. "That's what you all missed. Marriage isn't a business transaction or a social advancement strategy. It's supposed to be about two people who choose each other despite their flaws, not because of their utility." "That's a luxury for people who don't have real responsibilities," Eleanor snapped. "Derek has obligations to his family, his firm, and his future. He can't afford to make decisions based purely on emotion. And I can't afford to pretend to be someone I'm not for the rest of my life," I shot back. "Which is what your version of marriage would have required." The conversation was spiraling into territory that felt dangerous for everyone involved. Derek's professional reputation, Eleanor's social standing, Madison's role as the perfect sister, everything was being stripped away by the acid of uncomfortable truth. Judge Ashford, who had been watching the entire exchange with the fascination of someone observing a particularly compelling case study, finally stood up. "I think," he said with judicial authority, "that perhaps this conversation should continue in private. This is clearly a complex situation that affects not just the immediate parties, but their professional and family relationships." It was a diplomatic way of suggesting that we were all destroying ourselves in public, and several people immediately began gathering their belongings. The party was clearly over, but the damage was still being calculated. Derek looked around the emptying ballroom, taking in the faces of colleagues and family friends who were already distancing themselves from the scandal. His carefully constructed social network was crumbling in real time, and I could see him finally understanding the full cost of the day's revelations. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice carrying a threat I'd never heard before. "You've destroyed my reputation, embarrassed my family, and humiliated me in front of everyone who matters to my career. There will be consequences." "There already are consequences," I replied, "for both of us." Eleanor moved to Derek's side, her maternal instincts finally overriding her social calculations. "Come on, darling. Let's go home. We'll figure out how to handle this." As they walked toward the exit, Derek stopped and turned back to me one final time. "I hope he's worth it," he said, and for the first time, there was genuine pain in his voice. "I hope your paramedic husband is worth everything you've just destroyed." After they left, the ballroom continued to empty rapidly, Conversations buzzed with excitement and speculation as Derek's colleagues and family friends fled the scene of what would undoubtedly become legendary gossip in Chicago's legal and social circles. Madison remained, standing uncertainly near the abandoned microphone, her face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been admiration. "Liza," she said finally, "what the hell just happened?" I looked around the decimated ballroom, at the abandoned champagne glasses and scattered napkins, at the remnants of what was supposed to have been a celebration of my engagement. I said slowly, "I just remembered who I really am. The consequences were only beginning." Derek's threats weren't empty. He had connections, influence, and the kind of vindictive anger that could make my professional life very difficult. Eleanor's social network would close ranks against me, ensuring that I'd be persona non grata in Chicago's upper circles. And somewhere across town, my husband Michael was probably getting off his shift at the fire station, completely unaware that his estranged wife had just blown up her engagement party to defend their troubled marriage. But as I stood in the wreckage of Derek's carefully planned celebration, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine relief. The performance was over. The careful balancing act between who I was and who Derek needed me to be had finally collapsed. Now came the harder part, figuring out whether the marriage I'd just defended was actually worth saving, and whether the person I'd rediscovered under the pressure of Derek's expectations was someone Michael could still love. The real investigation was just beginning. The drive back to my apartment felt surreal. Madison sat in the passenger seat, uncharacteristically quiet, occasionally glancing at me as if seeing a stranger. The radio played soft jazz, the music Derek had dismissed as inappropriate for his social circle, and for the first time in months, I didn't change the station. "Are you going to call him?" Madison finally asked as we pulled into my parking space. She didn't need to specify who. Michael's presence had dominated the conversation at the party, but he remained an abstract figure to everyone who'd witnessed the explosion. To Madison, to Derek's family, to all those society guests, he was just the paramedic husband, a complication in what should have been a straightforward social arrangement. "I don't know," I admitted, turning off the engine. "We haven't spoken in 3 weeks. For all I know, he's already filed divorce papers." Madison unbuckled her seatbelt but made no move to get out of the car. "Liza, I have to ask, what you said back there about him loving you exactly as you are, is that actually true? Or were you just trying to hurt Derek?" The question cut deeper than she probably intended. During the confrontation, I'd spoken about Michael's love with passionate certainty, but sitting in the quiet car, I had to confront a more complicated truth. "I think it was true," I said slowly. "When we first got married, everything was simple between us. But people change, Madison. I changed, he changed. Whether we can find our way back to that, I honestly don't know." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the day's emotional wreckage. "Can I come up?" Madison asked. "I think we need to talk. Really talk, not just me giving you advice about how to manage your life." Upstairs in my apartment, Madison looked around with new eyes, taking in details she'd dismissed before. My bookshelves are filled with crime novels and investigative journalism, the small desk where I worked on complex cases, the photos I'd carefully hidden when Derek started spending time here, pictures of Michael and me from our early days together, laughing and clearly in love. "God, Liza," Madison said, picking up a framed photo from our Vegas wedding. "You look so happy here, so yourself." In the picture, I was wearing a simple sundress, my hair loose and natural, grinning at the camera while Michael dipped me dramatically in front of a cheesy Elvis chapel. We looked young and ridiculous and completely joyful. "I was happy," I said, settling onto the couch. "We both were. It just got complicated." Madison joined me, still holding the photo. "What happened? Why did you separate?" The question forced me to examine a story I'd been avoiding for months. It would have been easy to blame work schedules, financial stress, or the typical pressures that strain young marriages, but the truth was more fundamental. "We stopped seeing each other," I said finally. "Not literally. We lived in the same apartment, ate dinner together, shared the same bed, but we stopped really seeing who the other person was becoming." I thought about those final months before our separation, when Michael would come home exhausted from double shifts and I'd be buried in case files, both of us too tired to do more than exchange basic information about our days. Somewhere along the way, we'd become roommates who happened to be married rather than partners building a life together. Michael started picking up extra shifts, telling himself it was for our future, to build savings. But really, I think he was avoiding coming home to an apartment where we'd just sit in parallel silence, both too proud to admit we were struggling. Madison set down the photo carefully. And you? I threw myself into work, told myself I was building my career, establishing my reputation. But honestly, work was where I felt competent, where problems had solutions and effort led to results. Home felt like this complicated mess I couldn't analyze or fix. It was the first time I'd articulated the pattern so clearly. Madison nodded with unexpected understanding. So when Derek came along, Derek was easy, I admitted. He fit into the compartmentalized life I'd created. He didn't challenge me to be vulnerable or demand emotional availability. I wasn't sure I could provide. He appreciated my professional success without expecting me to share my deeper uncertainties. Madison was quiet for a long moment, processing this new perspective on the relationship she'd been so eager to celebrate. Liza, can I tell you something? Why was I so excited about you and Derek? I nodded, sensing this conversation was about to become more honest than any we'd had in years. It wasn't really about Derek, Madison said quietly. It was about relief. For years I've watched you be alone, and I kept thinking it was somehow my fault. Like maybe I took up too much space in our family, got too much attention, made it harder for you to feel like you deserved love. The confession surprised me. Madison had always seemed so confident in her place in the world, so certain about her choices and their value. When Derek proposed, I felt like I could finally stop worrying about you, stop feeling guilty about having the marriage and family life that seemed to come easily to me but not to you. I wanted you to have what I had, even if what I had wasn't necessarily what you needed. She paused, looking around my apartment again with fresh perspective. But listening to you today, hearing you defend who you really are, I realized I never asked what you actually wanted. I just assumed you wanted what I wanted, and when Derek offered something close to that, I pushed you toward it. The honesty in her voice was startling. For the first time in our adult relationship, Madison wasn't trying to fix me or manage my choices. She was simply acknowledging the complexity of our dynamic. Madison, you didn't make me settle for Derek. I did that all by myself. But I made it easier, she insisted. I reinforced the message that being with someone like Derek was an achievement, that you should be grateful for his attention instead of questioning whether he was right for you. My phone buzzed with a text message. We both looked at it automatically, and I felt my heart skip when I saw Michael's name on the screen. Heard through the EMT grapevine that something happened at a party today. You okay? The message was so perfectly Michael, concerned without being invasive, offering support without demanding explanations. It was the kind of communication Derek would never have sent. Too direct and emotionally available for his careful communication style. Madison read the message over my shoulder. He still checks on you. The Chicago first responder community is small, I said, though my heart was racing. Someone at the fire station probably heard gossip from someone who knows someone who was at the party. But even as I said it, I knew it was more than professional courtesy. Michael and I might be separated, might be struggling to figure out our marriage, but we still cared about each other's well-being. Are you going to respond? Madison asked. I stared at the phone, paralyzed by the weight of everything that response might set in motion. Texting Michael back would mean acknowledging that today's explosion had reminded me of what I'd been missing. That defending our marriage publicly had forced me to examine whether it was worth defending privately. Instead of answering immediately, I set the phone aside and looked at Madison. Can I ask you something? In your marriage with James, how do you handle the hard stuff? The times when you're not sure you're right for each other? Madison considered the question seriously. We fight, she said finally. Not the kind of polite disagreements Derek probably approved of, but real fights where we say things that hurt and then have to figure out how to forgive each other. She paused, thinking. I guess we trust that we love each other enough to work through whatever comes up, even when one of us is being impossible or unfair or scared. Were you ever scared you'd married the wrong person? Constantly, Madison laughed. Especially during the first few years. James has this way of pointing out when I'm being controlling or superficial, and I have this way of pointing out when he's being passive-aggressive or conflict-avoidant. We're both right, and we both hate being called on our stuff. It was a more honest description of marriage than anything I'd heard from Derek's social circle, where relationships seemed to be evaluated based on their contribution to professional advancement rather than emotional growth. But you stayed together. We stayed together because we decided our relationship was worth the work it required. Not because it was easy or convenient or socially advantageous, but because we genuinely liked the people we became when we were fighting for each other instead of against each other. The distinction resonated deeply. During my relationship with Derek, I'd been fighting against myself, trying to become someone more suitable for his world. During the good times with Michael, we'd been fighting for our relationship, working to understand and support each other through difficulty. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Michael: "Whatever happened, you don't have to handle it alone. I'm here if you need anything." This time, I picked up the phone and started typing before I could second-guess myself. "Can we talk? In person?" The response came almost immediately. "I'll be right over." Madison raised her eyebrows. That was fast. He was probably already in the car, I realized. He probably heard enough gossip to know something major happened, and he was waiting to see if I'd reach out. And if you hadn't, he would have respected my space and worried about me from a distance. That's who Michael is. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on my door. Madison squeezed my hand before heading to the kitchen, giving us privacy while remaining close enough to provide support if needed. Michael looked exactly the same as he had 3 weeks ago. Dark hair slightly messed up from running his hands through it when he was worried, brown eyes that could read my mood from across a room, wearing the faded jeans and t-shirt combination that Derek had once dismissed as inappropriately casual. "Hi," he said simply, and the word carried the weight of 3 months of separation, 6 months of problems and 3 years of marriage. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. We stood in my living room, the space where I'd entertained Derek, where Madison had coached me on appropriate behavior, where I'd hidden evidence of my real life to maintain the fiction of my availability. "So," Michael said, settling onto the couch with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there, "I heard you had an interesting day." Despite everything, I laughed. That's one way to put it. Danny Rodriguez was working backup at a medical call downtown, and heard from someone at the country club that there was some kind of scene at an engagement party. Rich people, lawyers, someone's secret husband showing up. "I'm the secret husband in this story. You're the secret husband." Michael was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "So you told him about us?" "I told everyone about us. Very publicly, very dramatically, at what was supposed to be our engagement party." "Our engagement party," Michael repeated slowly. "You were engaged to someone else." The words hung between us, carrying the weight of everything we hadn't discussed during our separation. Michael's face cycled through hurt, confusion, and something that might have been relief. "Michael, were you happy?" he interrupted. "With him, I mean. Were you happy?" The question was so typically Michael, concerned with my well-being even when he had every right to be angry about my choices. Derek would have started with accusations and demands for explanations. Michael started with whether I'd found what I needed, even if it wasn't with him. "I thought I was," I said honestly. "For a while. It was easier than being married to you." Michael flinched but didn't look away. "Easier? How?" He didn't challenge me. He didn't push me to be vulnerable or emotionally available. He appreciated the surface version of who I am without asking for the complicated stuff underneath, and that was what you wanted. I sat down beside him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, far enough away to think clearly. "I thought it was. I thought maybe we were too young when we got married. Too intense about everything." Derek offered something that felt more mature, more practical. But practical isn't the same as right, and mature isn't the same as authentic. Michael nodded slowly. "So what happens now?" It was the question I'd been avoiding all day, the one that would determine whether the explosion at the engagement party had been destruction or liberation. "I don't know," I admitted. "I know I don't want to be with Derek. I know I don't want to pretend to be someone I'm not just to fit into someone else's idea of a suitable partner. But Michael, I also know that you and I had real problems before I ever met Derek." "We did," he agreed. "We stopped talking to each other. We stopped making time for each other. We started treating our marriage like it would maintain itself without effort. And I don't know if we can fix that," I said quietly. "I don't know if we can find our way back to who we were when we were happy." Michael reached for my hand, his touch familiar and warm. "Maybe we can't go back. Maybe we're not supposed to. Maybe we're supposed to figure out who we are now, and whether these versions of ourselves can build something that works." The suggestion carried hope and uncertainty in equal measure. It wasn't the passionate reunion that romantic movies promised, but it was honest in a way that felt more valuable than grand gestures. Would you want to try? I asked, even after everything that's happened? Michael was quiet for a long moment, looking around the apartment where I'd tried to build a life that didn't include him. I've spent 3 months missing you, he said finally. Not just missing being married, but missing you specifically. The way you get completely absorbed in a case you're solving, the way you organize everything in neat little categories when you're stressed, the way you laugh at my terrible jokes even when you're mad at me. He paused, his thumb tracing patterns on my hand. But I also spent 3 months learning how to be myself when I'm not trying to fix whatever was wrong between us. And I think maybe that's what we both needed, to remember who we are as individuals before we try to be a couple again. It was the most honest assessment of our situation that either of us had offered, not a fairy tale reconciliation, but a mature recognition that love alone wasn't enough to sustain a marriage. We needed to rebuild from a foundation of understanding who we'd become during our time apart. From the kitchen, Madison cleared her throat softly. I'm going to head home, she called. Give you two some space to figure things out. As she gathered her things, Madison paused beside the couch where Michael and I sat holding hands. Liza, for what it's worth, I think you made the right choice today. It took courage to choose the truth over what was easy. After she left, Michael and I sat in comfortable silence, both of us processing the complexity of what lay ahead. The engagement party explosion had solved nothing and everything. It had ended a relationship that was wrong for me while creating space for the possibility of rebuilding one that might be right. So, Michael said eventually, do you want to try being married to each other again? For real this time? I want to try being honest with each other. I replied. About what we need, what we can give, what we're scared of, and see if we can build something sustainable from there. That sounds like a good place to start. As we began the difficult conversation about how to rebuild trust, navigate our different life rhythms, and create space for both of our ambitions, I realized that the investigation that had started with suspicious patterns in Derek's behavior had led me to the most important discovery of all: the difference between a relationship that looked right on the surface and one that felt right in all the complicated, messy places where real life happened. The party was over, the performance was finished, the real work of building an authentic life was just beginning. 6 months later, I stood in the small conference room at Peterson & Associates, presenting my findings on what had become the most complex insurance fraud case of my career. The company had grown substantially since the engagement party scandal, not despite the controversy but because of it. Word had spread through Chicago's legal community about the insurance investigator who'd exposed her own fiancé's deceptions with the same analytical precision she applied to fraudulent claims. Rather than damaging my reputation, the incident had enhanced it in unexpected ways. The pattern analysis reveals a sophisticated operation spanning 3 years, I explained to the assembled attorneys and adjusters, clicking through slides that displayed financial records, timeline correlations, and photographic evidence. What appeared to be random accidents were actually coordinated events designed to maximize insurance payouts while minimizing suspicion. The lead attorney for the insurance company, Patricia Huang, leaned forward with interest. How did you identify the connections? These incidents occurred across different jurisdictions, involved different adjusters, and showed no obvious links. I applied the same investigative techniques I use in all fraud cases, I replied, looking for patterns in behavior, inconsistencies in documentation, and motivations that don't align with surface appearances. The breakthrough came when I stopped looking at each incident in isolation and started examining them as parts of a larger system. It was a lesson I'd learned not just professionally but personally. The engagement party explosion had taught me that individual events, Derek's careful coaching, his mother's social management, my family's assumptions about my romantic life, only made sense when viewed as components of a larger pattern of deception and self-deception. After the presentation, as I packed up my materials, Patricia approached with an unexpected proposition. Liza, I've been following your work since the Riverside incident, she said, using the euphemism that had become shorthand for my very public engagement dissolution. You've developed quite a reputation for seeing through complex deceptions. I have a proposition for you. Patricia explained that her firm was expanding their fraud investigation division and looking for someone to head a new specialized unit, focusing on relationship-based insurance fraud, cases where personal relationships were used to facilitate financial crimes. It's a growing area, she explained. Staged accidents between supposed strangers who are actually related, fake marriages for insurance benefits, families staging elaborate scenarios to collect on life insurance policies. We need someone who understands both the technical aspects of fraud investigation and the psychological dynamics of how people deceive themselves and others about relationships. The offer was intriguing, but I had other considerations now. Can I discuss it with my husband? I asked, the words still feeling new and significant each time I said them. Patricia smiled. Of course, take whatever time you need. The word husband carried weight because Michael and I had only remarried 3 weeks earlier, in a small ceremony that bore no resemblance to either our impulsive Vegas elopement or the elaborate society wedding Eleanor Whitmore had probably been planning. This time we'd taken 6 months to rebuild our relationship slowly, attending couples counseling, learning to communicate about difficult topics, and establishing boundaries that protected both our individual identities and our partnership. The second wedding had been held in my parents' backyard, with 20 guests who actually knew and cared about us as individuals rather than as social accessories. Madison had served as my maid of honor again, but this time her speech had focused on genuine love and growth rather than relief that I'd finally found someone willing to settle. Michael was finishing his shift at Station 19 when I arrived to pick him up. I found him in the kitchen, making dinner for the crew with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to emergency medical calls. Watching him work, focused, competent, completely himself, I felt the same flutter of attraction that had drawn me to him 3 years earlier, but deeper now, rooted in genuine knowledge of who he was during difficult times as well as easy ones. How was the presentation? He asked, looking up from chopping vegetables with a smile that reached his eyes. Good, really good actually. Patricia Huang offered me a position heading a new fraud investigation unit. Michael set down his knife and gave me his full attention. Tell me about it. As I explained the opportunity, I watched his face for signs of the kind of calculation Derek might have shown, measuring how my career advancement might benefit or complicate his own goals. Instead, I saw genuine interest in my professional growth and excitement about my success. It sounds like exactly the kind of work you love, he said when I finished. Complex puzzles, real detective work, cases that matter. It would mean longer hours sometimes, more travel for depositions and court appearances. Michael nodded thoughtfully. And I'm picking up more shifts as we save for the house. We'd need to be even better about protecting our time together. It was the kind of practical conversation Derek and I had never managed. Honest about challenges, collaborative about solutions, focused on how to make both our ambitions work within our relationship rather than assuming one would automatically supersede the other. What's your gut reaction? Michael asked. I want to take it, I admitted. It feels like the right next step professionally, and honestly, it feels like proof that the engagement party disaster led somewhere positive instead of just destroying things. Michael grinned. Then I think you should take it. The simplicity of his support still surprised me. No complex analysis of how my career move might affect his social standing or professional advancement. No suggestions about how to manage the opportunity to minimize impact on his goals. Just genuine enthusiasm for my success. Later that evening, as we sat on the couch in our new apartment, a space we'd chosen together rather than adapting to someone else's vision, I found myself thinking about the contrast between this conversation and the careful negotiations that had characterized my relationship with Derek. Michael, can I ask you something? Always? Are you ever worried that we'll fall back into the patterns that caused problems before? The parallel lives, the taking each other for granted. Michael considered the question seriously. Sometimes, but I think we're different people now than we were 3 years ago. And more importantly, we're paying attention in ways we weren't before. He was right. The months of separation and careful reconciliation had taught us both to notice warning signs, the subtle drift toward taking each other for granted, the temptation to prioritize work over relationship maintenance, the tendency to assume understanding rather than actually communicating. Plus, Michael added with a grin, you're much better at confronting problems directly now. I don't think you'd let us slide into dysfunction without saying something. He was referring to what had become known in our relationship as the engagement party lesson, the recognition that avoiding difficult conversations ultimately created bigger problems than addressing issues honestly as they arose. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. Coffee tomorrow? I have news. Madison wants to meet for coffee, I told Michael. She says she has news. Good news or dramatic news? With Madison, there's often overlap. The next morning, I met Madison at our usual cafe in Lincoln Park. She looked different, more relaxed than I'd seen her in years, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual perfectly coordinated outfits. "You look good," I said as I sat down with my coffee. "I feel good," Madison replied, "which is actually what I wanted to talk to you about." She paused, organizing her thoughts in a way that reminded me of our new commitment to honest communication. "James and I have been talking a lot since your engagement party, about our relationship, about the way I was so invested in managing your romantic life, about what that said about my own insecurities." This was new territory for Madison, who had always preferred to focus on solutions rather than psychological examination. "We realized that I was using your single status as a way to avoid looking at problems in my own marriage. As long as I was worried about you being alone, I didn't have to confront the ways James and I had stopped really connecting." She took a sip of her latte, gathering courage for what came next. "So we've been doing couples therapy, real therapy, not just the kind of surface-level communication coaching I thought was enough before." "How's it going?" "Hard," Madison admitted. "Really hard. Turns out I'm much more controlling than I wanted to acknowledge, and James is much more passive-aggressive than either of us realized. But we're learning to fight productively instead of just avoiding conflict or managing each other." It was a more honest assessment of marriage than I'd ever heard from Madison, who had always presented her relationship as effortlessly perfect. "I'm proud of you," I said, meaning it completely. "It takes courage to do that kind of work." "I learned it from watching you," Madison replied. "The way you chose truth over convenience at the engagement party, even when it meant destroying something that looked good on the surface. It made me realize I'd been choosing the appearance of a perfect marriage over the work of building a real one." The conversation continued for another hour, covering territory we'd never navigated as sisters, honest discussion of our respective relationships, acknowledgement of the ways we'd influenced each other's choices, and genuine curiosity about each other's experiences rather than assumptions based on surface appearances. As we prepared to leave, Madison hesitated before saying, "Liza, I owe you an apology. For years, I treated your single status like a problem to be solved instead of recognizing that you were building a life you enjoyed, and when Derek came along, I pushed you toward him because he fit my idea of what you should want instead of asking what you actually wanted." "Madison, you were trying to help. I was trying to manage," she corrected. "There's a difference. And I think I made it harder for you to trust your own judgment about relationships." The apology carried weight because it acknowledged patterns I'd never felt safe pointing out directly. Madison's need to manage and improve my life had been disguised as sisterly concern, but it had contributed to my tendency to doubt my own instincts about what made me happy. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot." As I drove home from coffee with Madison, I found myself thinking about the unexpected ways the engagement party disaster had created positive changes not just in my life, but in the lives of people around me. Madison was working on her marriage with new honesty. I was building a career that utilized my investigative skills in increasingly sophisticated ways. Michael and I were creating a partnership based on mutual support rather than romantic fantasy or social convenience. Even Derek, according to mutual acquaintances, had ultimately benefited from the public exposure of his transactional approach to relationships. The scandal had forced him to examine his own motivations, and apparently led to significant changes in how he approached both personal and professional relationships. That evening, Michael and I sat at our kitchen table working on our respective projects. He was studying for paramedic certification exams that would qualify him for supervisory positions, while I reviewed case files for Patricia's fraud investigation unit. It was the kind of comfortable parallel focus that had felt like distance in our first marriage but now felt like partnership. "I called Patricia today," I said during a break. "I'm taking the position." Michael looked up from his textbook with genuine excitement. "That's fantastic. When do you start?" "Next month, which means I'll need to wrap up my current cases and transition my clients." "Anything I can do to help." The offer was typical Michael, practical support without trying to manage or direct my professional decisions. After months of Derek's subtle attempts to shape my career choices to complement his ambitions, Michael's straightforward willingness to support my goals without agenda still felt revolutionary. "Just keep being exactly who you are," I said. As we returned to our work, I reflected on the journey that had led from that humiliating engagement party explosion to this quiet evening of mutual support and shared ambition. The investigation that had begun with suspicious patterns in Derek's behavior had ultimately revealed the most important truth of all: the difference between relationships built on compatibility versus relationships built on convenience, between love that enhanced your authentic self versus love that required you to perform a more acceptable version of yourself. The engagement party had ended in spectacular failure, but that failure had created space for something real to emerge. Not the fairy tale romance Madison had wanted for me, not the strategic alliance Eleanor had envisioned for Derek, but a partnership between two people who had learned to see each other clearly and chose to build something together, despite the complexity that clear vision revealed. 6 months later, standing in my new office at Peterson & Associates, looking out at the Chicago skyline where Derek was probably networking at some professional event, and Eleanor was undoubtedly managing some social crisis, I felt the deep satisfaction that came from living authentically rather than performing appropriately. The secret wedding ring that had caused such chaos at the engagement party now sat openly on my finger, a symbol not of hidden deception but of chosen commitment. The investigation was complete, the case was closed, and the verdict was clear. The truth, however messy and inconvenient, was always worth pursuing. The party was over, but the real celebration, the daily choice to build a life based on honesty rather than appearance, was just beginning. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.